Healthcare is too expensive. Employers are offsetting costs onto their employees. Who will make health benefits affordable for hardworking Americans and their families? You will. This is the Empowering Plans Podcast, a show dedicated to helping you once again emphasize the benefit in benefit plan. Now prepare to learn, plan, save, and protect with the Phia Group.
Hello, and welcome to another installment of the Phia Group's Empowering Plans podcast. I'm Jon Jablon, and with me is attorney Katie Malkin. And we are here today to talk about some administrative simplification type things, but not for health plans, for TPAs. We all know that TPAs and claims administrators by any other name, you've got a lot going on. You've got a lot on your plates, and helping plans do plan things is really, really complicated. It takes a lot of work, and you certainly don't get paid enough. So we're going to talk about some things that we see TPAs doing on a daily basis that they incorporate into their processes to try to make their jobs easier and try to help plans in the best way they know how, while also keeping their jobs somewhat realistic. And the first thing on our agenda today is EOBs and denials. And these can be really, really complicated for TPAs to navigate, mainly because it's not that there are so many different requirements, because really there are only a few main requirements for an EOB, but they're a little bit vague and sometimes they're really hard to figure out. So I'll give you an example of some real examples of EOBs. Denied per plan. That's an EOB note. Another denial note, not covered under policy, or plan benefit exclusion, or discount or other exclusion, or unreasonable charges. Katie, what's wrong with those?
They're all very vague. It doesn't give the participant anywhere to start for any appeals. They really have no concrete idea of where they can go from there.
Yeah, and part of the problem is that there's no generic solution. There's no single EOB note you can write. In an ideal world, you could just reproduce the plan document and just sort of say, check out these provisions. Your claim is excluded pursuant to one of them. But that's not really what ERISA wants, is it, Katie?
No, actually, ERISA requires that any denials of claims contain the specific reason or reasons, if there are more than one, for the denial, and the specific plan language that supports that denial. So if you deny based off of a plan exclusion, cite to that actual exclusion. Don't just say it was denied because of a plan benefit exclusion.
Yeah, I mean, if the whole point of giving a detailed denial reason is to let people appeal, telling them that this is just denied generically pursuant to the plan, what can a person appeal? How can you provide more information to substantiate your claim and hopefully have the appeal overturned when all you know is, nope, we're not going to pay? I mean, Katie, what happens when a federal law is ambiguous or doesn't give maybe quite all the information you need to know? I mean, how do you view it?
Basically, plans just need to have a good faith, reasonable interpretation of that law. If there are ambiguities in the law, just use your best judgment of exactly what the law is asking you to do. And in this case, ERISA's goal is to create a meaningful dialogue between the plan administrators and the plan beneficiaries so they are able to appeal those benefit denials.
So when the law says that you have to contain a specific reason for the denial or specific plan language, we don't really know quite how specific, right? I mean, some people have said, well, do we need to include page numbers in the plan? I don't know, probably not. But what I usually say is that the specific reason is certainly more than denied per plan. We know it's per the plan. If it's not per the plan, you're not allowed to deny it in the first place. But writing denied per plan is definitely a reason, sort of, but it's hardly a specific reason. So, when ERISA's goal is for a meaningful dialogue between plan administrators and plan beneficiaries, it's really tough to say that not covered under policy or meets a plan benefit exclusion. It's tough to say that those really foster a meaningful dialogue, right, Katie?
100%.
Fantastic. Thanks, Katie. Let's move on to another topic that has been very complicated for TPAs in recent years. And a few years ago, we got a lot of questions about this. Sometimes when that happens, when we get a big influx of questions about a particular topic, it's because there's some industry webinar or something like that, and it becomes a hot topic very briefly, and then it sort of goes away. And we just got another question about this, and we thought, you know what? It's time for maybe a refresher or to bring this back up, because we do know that it's on some people's minds, and we know some TPAs do this, and we just want to make sure that we touch on it just in case. That issue is sending family EOBs or denials. And what I mean by that is instead of sending individual EOBs to adult dependents, some TPAs and plans send one EOB to the plan member and basically say, this is for your household, and it contains everybody's PHI. And a lot of TPAs view that as, well, yeah, this is the plan member. This is the actual employee enrolled in the plan. What are we going to do? Send 5 different letters? That's insane. No, we're going to send one letter with all the EOBs. Other TPAs view it more as a HIPAA concern, where they say, well, if there are adult dependents, each of those dependents gets their own PHI, and we can't just disseminate it across the entire household. It's a difference in opinion and interpretation, and there are some nuances in the law. I'll start just by saying that if one is a minor child, I imagine there are probably not too many minor children listening to this podcast, but when the PHI belongs to a minor child, typically, pursuant to state law, the adult caregiver has the right to that PHI as opposed to the minor child. So we're not really talking so much about minor children's PHI. We are talking about adult dependents' PHI. So, Katie, talk to us about family EOBs and what HIPAA says.
Absolutely. Basically, HIPAA allows plan administrator to use family EOBs as long as the adult dependent does not object. And typically that can be a reactive process, but it can also be proactive if an individual is given the chance. By that, I mean, if the TPA reaches out to their the spouses of the plan or any other adult dependents and asks for them to grant an authorization for release of PHI to the subscriber to the plan. Basically, HIPAA allows disclosures to the subscriber only if the recipient is somehow involved in the care or payment for the care. And this is still always subject to the HIPAA's minimum necessary requirement. How involved someone actually is questionable. How would the TPA even know if they're involved or not? Obviously, the subscriber is paying for the premiums, but whether that equates to paying for the actual care, it's a difference of interpretation, I think.
Katie, sorry, you mentioned the minimum necessary requirement. That's something that's always been a head scratcher for me. Not the requirement itself, but the idea of sending a family EOB and giving the member somebody else's PHI. How can you send an EOB with only the minimum necessary information for a third party? I mean, to me, that's kind of an oxymoron, because an EOB, the whole point is that you're sort of giving lots of information about a claim, and an EOB is designed to go to a person. And if you're disclosing PHI to that person, you don't need to abide by minimum necessary because it's that person's PHI, right? So for me, that's one problem that's inherent in sending family EOBs, is that the minimum necessary requirement, you sort of can't meet it. There's really sort of no way to give the minimum necessary because, I mean, for one thing, the minimum necessary might be 0, right? But that's another story. If the plan member is involved, like you said, involved in the care or involved in payment for the care, who is to say what information is then necessary, right? I mean, maybe it's just literally the dollar amount that's necessary or the ICD code or something. But an EOB typically has more information than that. So, it's tough to say when that minimum necessary requirement can actually be followed in this practice.
No, I totally agree. And I think, honestly, in my opinion, at least, the family EOBs may not be the best solution here unless you're also sending extremely vague EOBs, which we already talked about is an issue. It will probably run up against the minimum necessary requirement for HIPAA. It may also run up against state laws. Some state laws have restrictions on certain types of information, like reproductive health information or domestic violence, things like that, that can't be disclosed to other members in the family. So that's also, something to consider when you're considering doing these family EOBs, that it might not just be HIPAA, it could also be, a state law issue as well if you're disclosing this information to other people.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And Katie, for the record, I love when you agree with me. That's a fantastic way to start a sentence. It makes me so happy. So, to contrast to all that about the involved in the care or payment for care, and if the person doesn't object, there's also guidance that sort of says something a little bit different. There's guidance to suggest that the plan should get permission from the adult dependent, or that the plan should otherwise be able to, and I quote here, reasonably infer that the patient does not object before making the disclosure. So there's guidance to say basically that plan members can receive the PHI that actually belongs to adult dependents if that person needs the PHI or if the person is involved in the care or payment for care. But there's also guidance that says you should do your best to get permission. But if you really can't get permission, then the plan should reasonably infer that the patient doesn't object. I don't know how a plan could infer that, right? I mean, if you're just looking at a typical family, I imagine the TPA does not know sort of the specifics of the relations between all the people in that family, right? The TPA is just looking at names on a page and sending letters. How can the TPA reasonably infer that the adult dependent doesn't object? I mean, I guess one interpretation is that, well, the person hasn't objected yet, so I infer that the person does not object. Is that reasonable? I don't know. This is one of those good faith, reasonable interpretation things that Katie mentioned before, where when the law is not completely clear, you need to use good judgment under the circumstances. And when the regulations sort of say, you can do it, sure. But when the regulations also say, well, you should get permission, it's a judgment call, is what it comes down to. And as we all know, judgment calls can kind of be a pain because it's very, very easy to use poor judgment when you don't have a whole lot of guidance to go by to suggest how to exercise good judgment.
Mhm.
Katie, do you agree?
No, I totally agree.
Yes, she agrees, but she said no, which scared me.
Sorry.
But good. No, I'm just kidding. All right, let's move on to the last topic we've got on the agenda for today. Cross-patient or cross-plan offsetting for overpayments. Offsetting is a big buzzword in the overpayment context, and offsetting can be very, very confusing because it's not so intuitive. And overpayments themselves are often not so intuitive. So I'm going to step back from offsetting and just give a very, very quick overview of overpayments and sort of what happens when there's an overpayment. I'm not going to go into detail about how overpayments can happen because if you're a TPA, you know that overpayments do sometimes happen. It's a reality of claims processing. I've never seen anyone suggest that there should be a zero tolerance policy for overpayments. They happen. It is a fact. They can happen for many reasons. Some are the result of, inaccurate or untimely data. Some are the result of typos. I mean, it happens. So when an overpayment happens, we've seen plans try to take legal action against a provider to require the provider to return an overpayment. And what the courts universally say is the provider is not actually the one that has benefited from the overpayment. And if you hear that and you say, wait, what? We're with you. We are absolutely with you. If the provider gets money from the plan that it shouldn't have gotten, how on earth does the provider not benefit from that? That is crazy. Well, according to the courts, it's actually the patient that benefits because if the plan wasn't going to pay the claim, then the balance would have belonged to the patient. And so the patient really got paid, even though the provider literally got paid. And if you're scratching your head at that one too, we're with you. We promise. But technically speaking, I guess it makes sense if we sort of think about it from a theoretical perspective. Well, yeah, if the patient was going to have the balance and then the plan paid money to the provider, the patient's balance is smaller. If the plan's overpayment lowered the patient's balance, then the patient is the one that benefits. Sure, whatever. We sort of have no choice but to take that as the gospel because that is what the courts universally say. So let's just assume that the patient is the one that benefits from an overpayment. Now, in the subro context, offsetting benefits, meaning withholding future benefits, for instance, if a subro reimbursement has not been given, that has been used for years and it's fairly clear cut, and we have advocated for it for years. We say, you need strong plan language, but ultimately courts have upheld offsetting, right? So for instance, if a person has claims paid by the plan, an individual, for something like a motor vehicle accident, and then the person gets a settlement from a third party, well, as we all know, that's where subrogation comes into play because the plan's benefits are not designed to be a windfall. If the patient gets a settlement and basically the plan's benefits are repaid to the patient's got to repay the plan. None of that is news, and if it is news, you need to call us immediately. But subrogation is a reality of claims processing, and courts have pretty much been fine with offsetting in that context because if the person owes money to the plan, just like an overpayment benefits the individual, the patient, rather than the provider, so does the patient owe the plan money. So next time the patient has a claim at that provider or any other, the plan can say, sorry, patient, you've already been paid, in the form of not reimbursing the plan. And I hope that makes sense. I don't know if I'm explaining it well. It's a little bit complicated just from a conceptual standpoint, but if the patient has money that belongs to the plan, then the plan can be considered to basically have already paid the patient that money, and the plan can offset future amounts payable for that patient's care, even if it's with another provider. And yeah, the provider's claim gets denied, and the provider can say, well, I have nothing to do with that subrogation reimbursement. It's not my fault that the patient didn't pay you. To which the plan responds, no, it's the patient's fault. So the patient owes you your bill. Take it up with the patient. If the patient wants to reimburse the plan, then sure, the plan will pay the claim. But if that hasn't happened, no, in the overpayment context, it's not necessarily more complicated, but there's a very different perception of the situation. The reason for that is because even though the liability for an overpayment may technically be the patient, because remember, courts say actually the patient is the one who was overpaid, not the provider, that's not how plans and TPAs view it, because the provider is being viewed as the bad actor because the provider is the one refusing to refund the overpayment. Right? I mean, when an overpayment is made, TPAs don't go to the patient and say, hey, patient, you owe us 10 grand. Patient says, no, thanks. No, instead, the TPA and the plan, they go to the provider and say, hey, provider, you were overpaid the 10 grand. You give it back to us. And often the provider also says, no, thanks. So when plans and TPAs can't get money back from a provider that they feel they are owed due to an overpayment, they sometimes do an offset. Now, offsetting in the subro context is usually with the same person because it's very clear that the person, the individual, the patient, owes the plan money. But in the overpayment context, it's not quite so clear because that's not how plans view it. When plans view it as the provider owing the money, often plans and TPAs will offset against the provider as opposed to against the plan. So for instance, when a different patient or even a different patient from a different health plan incurs a claim at that provider, sometimes the TPA says, that provider, the one that owes us money, we're going to offset this other person's claim. Now, Katie, why is that a problem?
Well, just like you had mentioned earlier, the claim isn't the provider's, but actually it's the patient's. It's up to the patient to pay back the plan, and the plan would be denying the patient's claim arbitrarily if they do deny the claim by that provider when it's the other patient's responsibility for the overpayment.
Yeah, I wrote a blog post on this a while back, and I believe I called it Robbing Peter to Pay Paul, the problem with cross-plan offsetting. The idea is that when somebody incurs a claim, if you're offsetting that claim to punish the provider, well, the person who incurred the claim, you're denying that person's claim. And the person says, why didn't you pay my claim? If the answer is, well, this provider owes us money, that's not going to fly. Because like Katie said, it's not the provider's claim, it's the patient's claim. And Katie, I think that was extremely well put. That's a really, really good way to categorize it and something I was struggling to articulate, but then you just took it and nailed it. So thank you for that. Thanks for helping clarify what I was saying. So cross-plan offsetting is generally something that the Department of Labor frowns upon. They put out some guidance saying, we don't really like this. And it's for the exact reason that Katie articulated. So even though TPA, even though it tries to help make your job easier and recover overpayments when a provider is otherwise being stubborn and refusing, we are of the opinion that it is not compliant with ERISA because it essentially amounts to denying the other patient's claim arbitrarily, even if that patient is on the same health plan that the TPA feels is owed the money. It's all about the patient. The patient is the most important person here. And it's funny because that seems to be a common theme among all three things we've talked about today, right? The specificity in EOBs and sending family EOBs and cross-patient or cross-plan offsetting for overpayments. The whole reason that these can be potentially problematic is because the patient has a ton of rights. And when TPAs are doing these things, obviously you're not saying, we don't care about the patient, we're going to do it our way. No, you're trying to make everybody's lives easier. You're trying to perform your own services in a sort of a practical way, but the ability to do that is tempered by the idea that doing these things can be somewhat damaging to the patient if these things are not done correctly. So that's going to be it for what we're talking about today. And Katie, I don't know if you have any closing thoughts.
I think you handled it perfectly. I think TPAs really need to be wary of their current practices and make sure that they are trying to disclose the minimum necessary and be as specific as possible for participant EOBs.
Yeah, well put. Thank you. On behalf of Katie and myself, thank you so much for listening to this installment of the Empowering Plans podcast, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks.